The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittees on Transportation Security and Counterterrorism and Intelligence will come to order. The subcommittees are meeting today to hear testimony on our ability to safeguard our nation's surface transportation systems against evolving terrorist threats. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's hearing. I am pleased to be joined by fellow New York delegation members, Chairman Peter King, Ranking Member Kathleen Rice, and Ranking Member Brian Higgins, to talk about a topic that is so vital to the state of New York. Protecting our nation's surface transportation systems requires full cooperation and participation at the federal, state, local, and individual levels. An attack on any of our surface transportation systems not only disrupt the local economy and infrastructure, but would have a ripple effect to cities across our nation. For example, in my own district in Syracuse, New York, we have a freight line that runs through our downtown area and provides critical economic benefit to the region. The purpose of today's hearing is to assess our ability and readiness to detect and disrupt threats to our nation's critical surface transportation systems. Before we begin, I would like to express my pride and admiration for the 4 Americans that, through unrivaled acts of courage and bravery, were able to thwart a terrorist attack aboard a Paris-bound train on August 21st, 2015. The heroic actions of these 4 men, Mark Mugulian, a teacher originally from Midlothian, Virginia, Anthony Sadler, a senior at Sacramento State University, Air Force Airman First Class Spencer Stone, and Oregon Army National Guard Specialist Alex Scarlatos, saved countless lives. They really represent the best of what America has to offer. However, it is our responsibility to the American people to do all that we can to defend them against such heinous acts, and American people should not be put in a position requiring them to defend their lives while riding a train, subway, or bus to vacation, commute to work, or simply to run an errand. Since September 11th of 2001, many people have come to think of a terrorist attack against the United States as one which is an elaborate scheme against a hardened target. Increasingly, however, the terrorists and their sympathizers are choosing soft targets. The Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, the military recruiting center's attack in Chattanooga, and now the train attack in Paris are just a few of such examples. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on the perspectives on the state of rail and mass transit security, to identify progress made since the terrorist attacks on September 11th, and assess any remaining shortfalls and how to address them. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter I sent to Administrator Neffinger from the Transportation Security Administration, expressing my concern over the vulnerable state of security of our nation's surface transportation systems. Without objection, it's so ordered. I now recognize a member of the Subcommittee on Transportation Security, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Rice, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. I also want to thank the witnesses for joining us here today to discuss the evolving threats to our nation's surface transportation systems. Since the beginning of the 114th Congress, this subcommittee has mainly focused its attention on aviation security, but with all modes of surface transportation carrying well over 10 billion passengers each year and more than 2.5 million miles of pipeline carrying hazardous liquids and natural gases, I'm confident we can all agree that surface transportation security is equally as important. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity today to address the security challenges facing the surface transportation sector as we assess the evolving threats of terrorism. Last month, 4 individuals, including 3 brave Americans, thwarted a potential mass shooting when a man carrying a machine gun and a knife boarded a high-speed train traveling from Amsterdam to Paris. That should serve as a vivid reminder to us all that the threat of terrorism is just as real on our trains as it is on our planes, and we must be prepared to confront and neutralize that threat wherever we may find it. We must work together to rigorously assess our surface transportation systems and ensure that we have adequate procedures in place to respond to a terrorist attack on an American pipeline or mass transit system. We must have reliable, comprehensive security plans in place for a wide range of scenarios. We must have seamless communication between government entities and transit agencies, and we must continue to encourage the public to be vigilant at all times, because as we saw last month in France, that can be the difference between life and death. I'm very eager to hear what both the TSA and the private sector are doing to guarantee the safety of our citizens, not only those who travel on our mass transit systems, but also those who live near pipelines and freight railroads, as well as those who travel every day on our highways. I'm also eager to hear what frontline security training is currently provided to our transit system workers, given that TSA has not yet fulfilled the statutory mandate that they develop and implement security training requirements for public transportation, rail, and bus workers. In July, Ranking Member Thompson and I asked the GAO to review TSA's surface inspection program. Specifically, we asked about the roles and responsibilities of those inspecting surface transportation, how the structure of the inspection program aligns with TSA's mission, and what steps are being taken to measure its effectiveness. I look forward to seeing the results of that review upon its completion, and I would welcome any additional information about those questions that our witnesses could provide today. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for convening this hearing. I look forward to a productive dialogue today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, Mr. King, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this joint hearing with the Counterterrorism and Intelligence Subcommittee today on terror threats to surface transportation. And if I may be allowed, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that yesterday the House passed H.R. 720, which you sponsored, to require all airports and other surface transportation hubs to establish procedures responding to security threats such as active shooters. This was in response to the tragic murder of TSA screener Gerardo Hernandez, who was shot and killed back in November of 2013 at LAX. So it will now be sent to the President for signature. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate you on this passage of your first public law. It took me a lot longer to get there than it did you, so congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And by the way, as part of that, I think the fact you're holding this hearing today, this joint hearing, is emblematic of the dedication you have on this, as does Ms. Rice and Ranking Member Higgins. So with the recent attempt by a terrorist on a high-speed rail in Europe to take multiple lives, we are more cognizant than ever of the vulnerability of our public transportation infrastructure. That day, as Chairman Katko mentioned, passengers were fortunate to have among them 4 brave Americans, including 2 members of America's armed forces, who reacted swiftly and bravely to take down the Islamist extremists who attempted to take as many lives as possible that day. But the odds are that when the next would-be terrorist attacks passengers on a train or a subway, the public may not be so fortunate to have such capable people on board who are ready to react. The easy access to rail transportation is one of the features that makes it so popular. Compared with air travel, most of us individually appreciate the relative ease of using subways like the Metro here in D.C., or MTA in New York, or commuter rail, such as the Long Island Railroad, or Metro North. Everyone values and enjoys simple and easy access. However, as we've seen, the vulnerability inherent in easy access in most transit services, including, we've seen that in London, Mumbai, Madrid, Tokyo, and now in Paris. And I think as a New Yorker, where we have, in New York City alone, literally thousands of train stations, entrances, and exits, combine that with Grand Central Station, Penn Station, you realize just how challenging this is. With ISIS urging supporters to carry out attacks in the U.S., we have to continue to evaluate the threat, vulnerability, and related security measures within our security transportation infrastructure. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses about efforts to deter and prevent attacks, as well as how we are balancing the efficiency of public transit with security. A key issue is how the federal government is assisting state, local, and regional partners to better protect the traveling public against the threat of terrorism on America's public transportation and commuter rail systems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the testimony, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. King. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, Mr. Higgins, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to examine options for enhancing the safety and security across our surface transportation sectors. The attacks of 9/11 focused and exploited the weaknesses inherent in our aviation security to perpetuate one of the worst attacks on the United States soil. However, we must remember other modes of transportation have been and remain a top priority for terrorist groups worldwide and their affiliates. There have been devastating terrorist attacks against all modes of surface transportation across the globe, including train bombings in Belarus, India, Russia, Spain, and the United Kingdom, and most recently a shooting on a train traveling from Amsterdam to Paris. While there has not been a successful transportation-related attack by al-Qaeda in the United States since 9/11, there have been a number of thwarted plots My concern with this issue led me to introduce legislation in July entitled the Known Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Threats to Transportation Act. The Department of Energy plans to begin transporting highly enriched uranium liquid from Canada to South Carolina next year. The Department of Energy proposes to transport this waste, which is far more radioactive than spent nuclear fuel, across the northern border at the Peace Bridge, crossing through several states and municipalities before reaching South Carolina. An attack on one of these trucks crossing the Peace Bridge could contaminate the Great Lakes, which contains 84% of North America's surface fresh water, with highly radioactive material. Moreover, an attack on a truck moving through heavily populated areas throughout the United States would have obvious and devastating consequences. Despite these risks, the Department of Energy is about to begin importing highly radioactive material, which has never before been shipped in this manner, using outdated pre-9/11 information that does not reflect the threats we face today. My bill, which was advanced through my Counterterrorism and Intelligence Subcommittee today unanimously, would direct the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis to conduct an assessment of the risks associated with the transportation of chemical, biological, nuclear, and radiological materials. The bill also mandates that the Office of Intelligence and Analysis consult and share information with the heads of other federal agencies, including the Transportation Security Administration, so that the assessment is informed by the most current information about Homeland Security threats. As my bill continues to move through the House and the Senate, I hope to raise awareness of the security risks and protections needed within surface transportation sector of our country. Again, I thank Chairman King, Chairman Katko, and my fellow ranking member Rice for their leadership in focusing our oversight on this hearing. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have with us today a group of distinguished witnesses to speak on this very important topic. Let me remind the witnesses that their entire written statements will appear in the record, and I simply want to caution you that we are going to be interrupted at some point for votes today, so the more brief the opening statements, it would be probably most productive for us, so I'd appreciate you accommodating us on that. Our first witness today is Mr. Eddie Manshine, did I say that correctly? All right, who serves as the Assistant Administrator in the Office of Security Policy and Industry Engagement at the Transportation Security Administration. Previously, Mr. Manshine served as an executive at United Airlines and was Vice President of Flight Operations for Ameriflight, the world's largest Part 135 airline. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Manshine to testify.
Good afternoon, Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Rice, Chairman King, and Ranking Member Higgins, distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Transportation Security Administration's role in surface transportation security. The surface transportation enterprise is massive. It is a huge challenge to secure surface transportation systems in a society where the free movement of people and commerce is not only expected, it is a valued way of life. Unlike the aviation realm where TSA conducts security operation, TSA's role in surface is focused primarily on oversight, cooperation, and regulation. Since its inception, TSA has worked collaboratively with surface transportation operators, security partners, and the federal interagency to ensure appropriate security posture. Our emphasis has been fourfold: intelligence and information, sharing transportation security grants, training and exercises, and operational augmentation. Since 2002, TSA has valued collaborative information sharing among interagency and industry partners. Intelligence and information sharing efforts are conducted through such entities such as the Transit Policing and Security Peer Advisory Group, or the PAG, consisting of chiefs of police and security directors from 27 entities, including the largest U.S. public transportation systems, also Canada and the United Kingdom. We also host forums such as the annual Mass Transit and Passenger Rail Security Roundtable and monthly industry operator conference calls in all modes. TSA advises FEMA for DHS surface transportation grants and develops risk-based funding priorities on security initiatives in surface transportation. Since 2006, $2.3 billion has been made available via various security grant programs. Through close work with our partners, we provide resources for security exercises and training. With Congress's help, TSA created the Intermodal Security Training and Exercise Program, or ISTEP, to assist surface entities testing and evaluating their security plans and their ability to respond to incidents. Most recently, an ISTEP exercise was conducted in Philadelphia to prepare for the papal visit. And as was the practice first initiated by DOT's Federal Transit Administration, TSA also works very closely with our stakeholders to update and disseminate recommended security guidelines, such as security action items for mass transit, highway, and freight rail, motor coach security best practices, and pipeline security smart practice observations. Lastly, each of the surface modes has developed or is developing handbooks, guides, and/or security DVDs, web-based training addressing such subjects as sabotage, IED detection and response, and highlights the DHS-sponsored Run, Hide, Fight active shooter training. The TSA First Observer program trains highway professionals to observe, assess, and report potential security and terrorism incidents. Beginning in 2004, and also with congressional support and authorization, TSA expanded the National Explosive Detection Canine Program to include mass transit, passenger rail systems, and ferries. Currently, 139 transit and maritime canine teams are deployed to high-risk systems. In the aftermath of the terrorism incidents in London's transit system in 2005, TSA created the Visible Intermodal Prevention and Response, the Viper Team concept, to augment law enforcement and security personnel to enhance security in the nation's transportation system. Currently, 31 Viper teams are based in 20 high-risk locations throughout the nation. TSA appreciates the collaborative working relationship we have with our industry partners, including those from Amtrak and New York MTA, who are testifying on this panel today. The recent incident in France is a reminder that we collectively must remain attentive to worldwide threats and incidents. Following that incident, transit and law enforcement agencies across the nation participated in an Amtrak-sponsored operation known as RailSafe, which is conducted several times each year to deter terrorist activity through unpredictable security activities. I thank the committee members for their interest and, most importantly, their demonstrated support of these issues, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Manshine, for your testimony. We appreciate you being here today. Our second witness is well known to us, Ms. Jennifer Grover, who currently serves as a Director for Transportation Security and Coast Guard Issues on U.S. Government Accountability Office's Homeland Security and Justice team. Ms. Grover, I just want to note that you've provided great information for us in both a secure and a non-secure setting in the past, and I look forward to hearing from it again today. And I encourage you, as always, to be as frank and as forthright as possible with issues so that we can best address them moving forward.
Thank you.
With that, I recognize you to testify.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss TSA's efforts to secure the U.S. surface transportation system. As many of you have already noted, rail and transit systems, pipelines, and the nation's highway transportation system are inherently vulnerable to attack and difficult to secure because they're open systems with multiple access points where people and vehicles can generally move about freely. In this situation, good intelligence and robust communication about possible threats becomes critically important. Compared to aviation, where TSA has a direct role in providing security, TSA's role in surface transportation security is indirect. For example, TSA contributes to surface transportation security by providing industry with recommended security standards and conducting voluntary security assessments. TSA is also responsible for gathering information and sharing intelligence about potential threats. Specifically, TSA requires U.S. rail agencies to report all rail security incidents, with the intent of allowing TSA to analyze the data, identify new threats, and alert the rail industry and law enforcement. For this to work, though, TSA has to receive consistent and accurate information on these rail incidents. They have to have a data management system in place to capture the information, to conduct appropriate analysis, and have effective data sharing mechanisms. TSA has recently taken steps to improve in all of these areas. In 2012, GAO found that TSA headquarters had not provided guidance to local TSA officials called surface inspectors about the types of rail security incidents that rail systems had to report, which led to inconsistent reporting. As a result, the number of incidents per million riders reported by 7 passenger rail systems ranged from less than 1 to 23 during 2011. Now, some variation is always to be expected, but in this case, passenger rail officials told us that they had received inconsistent feedback from TSA's surface inspectors about what should be reported, particularly for incidents involving weapons. We also found that TSA's enforcement of the reporting requirement varied, with some rail systems not inspected at all over an 18-month period, and TSA inspectors taking action against some rail systems but not others when both rail systems failed to report the same type of incident. In addition, the quality of TSA's data was poor, as its data management system didn't capture all incidents and was prone to data entry errors. Due to other technical limitations, TSA couldn't provide basic information such as the number of incidents by type or rail system. Without this type of analytic ability, TSA faced challenges in identifying patterns or trends in the data, as the system was intended to do. Finally, in June 2014, GAO also found that surface transportation stakeholders varied in their level of satisfaction with TSA's security-related information sharing, but TSA did not have a systematic process for collecting and addressing stakeholder feedback to ensure that the information they were providing was of value. In response to our recommendations on these issues, TSA provided guidance to surface inspectors and rail systems to clarify reporting requirements and took steps to enhance the consistency of its inspection process. TSA has also made improvements to capture data on previously unreported security incidents and changed the data system to improve its analytic capabilities. In addition, TSA has developed a new process to document and respond to stakeholder feedback on its efforts. Collectively, these changes address the intent of our recommendations. If TSA implements them effectively going forward, they will help to ensure that the rail security incident reporting process is consistently implemented and that TSA has the tools and information necessary to develop a useful, comprehensive, and accurate picture of security incidents, as well as developing trends or patterns. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Grover, for your testimony. We appreciate you taking the time to be here today as well. Our third witness, Mr. Raymond Diaz, who is currently serving as a Director of Security at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Previously, Mr. Diaz served as Chief of the Transit Bureau with the New York City Police Department. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Diaz to testify.
Good afternoon, Chairman Katko and Chairman King and other members of the subcommittees. Thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting me to discuss security at New York's Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Joining me today is Michael Cohen, the Chief of Department for the MTA Police. Before joining the MTA in January of 2014 as Director of Security, I served as Chief of New York City Police Department's Transit Bureau, responsible for the safety and security of the MTA New York's transit system. During my 41-year career with the NYPD, I also served as commanding officers of Patrol Boroughs North and Patrol Boroughs South and the School Safety Division. Before joining the NYPD, I served in Vietnam with the United States Marine Corps. In my present position, I'm responsible for the security of the MTA, including coordinating MTA efforts with the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the National Guard, the NYPD, and the New York and Connecticut State Police. I oversee the MTA Police Department, which has a jurisdiction in 14 counties in New York and Connecticut and patrols a 5,000 square mile rail network. I'm responsible for the implementation and execution of a security strategy that offers maximum protection to the public, the MTA employees, and MTA property. Before I discuss security in more depth, I'd like to set the stage with some basic facts about the MTA. Every day, we move more than 8.7 million people on our subways, buses, and commuter rail lines. We're one of the few transit systems in the world that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Our 7 bridges and 2 tunnels carry nearly 300 million vehicles a year. Our network of trains, buses, bridges, and tunnels is a $1 trillion asset, meaning this: if we were to build our network today, including about 9,000 rail cars, 5,000 buses, and millions of other assets, it would cost nearly $1 trillion. Protecting millions of people a day at a $1 trillion asset is an enormous task. I can tell you that the MTA's priority is clear: ensuring the safety and security of our customers and our employees. To protect our customers and our asset, the MTA employs a multi-layered security strategy. Some strategies, like policing, are highly visible. Others are less visible, like structural hardening, advances in technology, and improved communications. The hallmark of policing our 5,000 square mile territory is collaboration. Let me explain. In response to the growing threat of active shooter attacks, over 95% of our PD officers have received Transit Security grant-funded active shooter training. In addition, over 60 officers have received heavy weapons training. We have a robust See Something, Say Something campaign coupled with security awareness training for our frontline employees. The two serve to encourage vigilance as well as educate individuals as to what appropriate action should be taken when suspicious activity is observed. To date, the MTA has trained in excess of 35,000 frontline employees. The recent incident of a potential active shooter in France, thwarted by vigilant rail passengers, clearly illustrates the importance of such awareness initiatives and training. Transit Security Grant Program grant awards have also supported our See Something, Say Something campaign and our civilian employee training. Behind the scenes, one critical layer to our security is the structural and technological hardening of our infrastructure. Since 9/11, the MTA has invested close to $1.4 billion of local funds towards an aggressive campaign to harden our subway and our commuter rail systems, as well as our bridges, tunnels, and other infrastructure. Critical stations and vulnerable areas have been secured with electronic security systems consisting of CCTV, intrusion detection, and access control devices. We've also deployed chemical, biological, radiological detection technology at such locations. We've benefited from over $400 million in support from our security program from DHS since 2003. TSA and FEMA have helped us immeasurably with grant allocations and reallocations. Unfortunately, the trend of a shrinking national program has limited our ability to move forward with our capital security mitigations. For example, in fiscal year 2009, the MTA received $92 million of a $349 million national program. 6 years later, the national appropriation has dropped by 75%, leaving only $87 million for transit agencies across the country. We're grateful for the support and are pleased that the initial period of performance for transit security grants has been extended to 36 months, which affords us time needed to complete capital security projects funded through the TSGP. Another layer of MTA's security strategy is communication and intelligence sharing. At the federal level, we have excellent working relationships with our DHA partners represented by FEMA and TSA. We attend regular meetings, conference calls, and continually exchange information. When potential threats are identified, they're communicated immediately. We share intelligence with many law enforcement agencies on a daily basis through our Interagency Counterterrorism Task Force. Additionally, we conduct joint patrol initiatives with other regional transportation agencies, including Amtrak, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Transit, the New York and Connecticut State Police, the New York State National Guard, and the NYPD. MTA PD detectives represent the MTA on the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, the FBI Cyber Crimes Unit, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, and the NYPD Counterterrorism and Intelligence Units. I'm proud to oversee this system and its proactive and accomplished security personnel, and look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues in law enforcement and you in the House to keep our customers safe and our systems secure. Once again, thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz, for your testimony and for being here today. Our fourth witness is Chief Polly Hansen, who serves as Amtrak Chief of Police, overseeing more than 500 law enforcement offices and civilians across the nation. Previously, Chief Hansen served for 27 years as a Metro Transit Police, at the Metro Transit Police, rising to the position of Chief of Police and Director of Office of Law Enforcement and Security at the U.S. Department of Interior. Ms. Diaz, I'll note, and for the rest of the panel, that our votes have been called, and so after your testimony, we will take a break to go do the votes and then reconvene.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. The Amtrak Police Department was created to protect Amtrak's employees, passengers, rolling stock, and other critical infrastructure. We do that by working closely with our colleagues in the law enforcement and counterterrorism communities to collect intelligence, pilot new technology, and surge our resources. The Amtrak Police Department consists of more than 500 members based in 30 locations. Our patrol officers are the most visible part of our department. They patrol stations, ride trains, perform education and enforcement on railroad safety, and are the first response to Amtrak incidents. Our Special Operations Unit consists of officers with tactical skills who perform station surges, conduct random passenger bag screening, perform counter surveillance, and dignitary protection. Our canine program, which consists of both conventional and vapor wake detection dogs, average 1,000 train rides a month. Terrorist tactics continue to evolve, and we must keep pace. U.S.-based extremists will continue to pose the most frequent threat to the U.S. homeland. As tragic attacks in Boston and New York have shown, the new terrorist threat is already here. From lone wolf attackers to ISIL radicals, we see a greater likelihood of attack now than we have in years. The internet and cyberspace have become the new recruiting ground and the new battle space. Aided by the internet and social media, ISIL has featured plans to kill U.S. soldiers and law enforcement, and the recent attack in France demonstrates the threat is evolving and increasing. Across the country, we coordinate with numerous other local, state, and federal agencies. We have officers assigned to the FBI National Joint Terrorism Task Force, as well as joint terrorist task forces in Baltimore, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C. One of our most visible efforts builds on a partnership with TSA that led to the creation of something called RailSafe. Amtrak Police, NYPD, and TSA started RailSafe in 2010, and there have been 50 RailSafes in 42 states, the District of Columbia, and Vancouver, British Columbia, involving over 265 agencies and over 1,600 law enforcement members since 2010. Amtrak has used DHS funding to provide our RailSafe partners and other first responders with training on the sharing of intelligence and the unified response to Amtrak incidents. Internationally, Amtrak Police partner with foreign law enforcement agencies in Europe with RailPol, where we share information on policing, intelligence, and Amtrak has a working relationship with Interpol. The Amtrak Intelligence Unit coordinates with the United States Department of Transportation. We have members aligned with regional fusion centers, and we do welcome the Viper teams who deploy at many of our stations on an unpredictable and random basis. Amtrak is a DHS test bed for piloting of new technology, and we have taken advantage of the TSA baseline for security enhancement, which highlights Amtrak's security posture and adherence to accepted security practices. To extend our reach, we've developed programs that enable our employees as well as our passengers to report things that strike them as suspicious. We've trained our employees in techniques to spot suspicious behaviors, and by using phones or texting, have added tens of thousands of eyes to our efforts to watch over our passengers, trains, and facilities. It is a part of our larger strategy of working collaboratively with partner organizations and passengers so that we can add their unique strengths to our own to ensure the safety of our systems and the communities we serve. Amtrak has taken advantage of DHS campaigns like If You See Something, Say Something, and passengers' employees can text us at APD11. Since the creation of TSA, there have been many security measures implemented, but we need to continue our partnerships, encourage our employees, passengers, and patrons to be observant and report suspicious activity. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Amtrak police role in rail passenger protection, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have when you return.
Thank you, Ms. Hanson. There's a series of 3 votes. We anticipate it being, first vote is just about ready to be expired, so we got to roll. We have 2 5-minute votes after that. As soon as the last vote is done, we'll start here again in 10 minutes. So without objection, the committee and subcommittee is in recess, subject to the call of the chair. The Subcommittee on Transportation, Security, and Counterterrorism and Intelligence will come to order. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to ask questions. I want to make a kind of an overarching observation first before I get into some questions, and that is, I'm very mindful of the surface transportation attacks that have occurred overseas in Europe, and the tragedy of them from years ago until more recently, and the attempts more recently. And it does make me conclude that we are vulnerable to that in this country as well. And it was compounded when I went to Penn Station recently and took a tour there, and just the sheer mass of people there on a regular basis, and the different entry points, and the different trains that are there, the different agencies that are there, Amtrak and Metro North and the subways and everything else. And it just really does, I shudder to think what a tragedy that could happen there, and just like you think about it in airports. The difference between the rails and airports are that airports have a tremendous amount of scrutiny to them right now and a tremendous amount of security. And I am concerned that the surface transportation system is lacking in the amount of security that it needs, but I'm interested to hear from the viewpoints of all of you that are on the front lines every day, particularly Mr. Diaz and Ms. Hanson and Mr. Manshine, and also your observations, Ms. Grover, throughout your testimony with others today as to what do you think can be done better. And so I guess to start out with Mr. Diaz, Ms. Hanson, since you have been on front lines for most of your careers, if not all of them, that you kind of give me your observation of what you think the overall state of security is and what you think needs to be done moving forward. And we can start with Ms. Hanson, if you would, please.
I think there are a couple really wonderful things working. You mentioned New York, and I can speak to there, but other places as well. And in my testimony and others, you did hear people talk about collaboration and partnership. So New York has a very strong partnership with all the entities and more that you described that do provide service in and out of Penn Station. And they, law enforcement executives, security people, freight members, and others have quarterly meetings, and we just have had several to coordinate and communicate about the Pope's visit. So I think you have a very strong presence there that's integrated, a tremendous amount of professionalism. That said, you also have layered security in the way that there's technology, certainly using things like text-to-tip, which we use and other transportation entities use, because you do have to rely on the 700,000 people that are in Penn Station a day and the thousands of employees that we all have there. My 27 years at Metro, I always thought one of the most important employees was the custodian, because that's somebody who's very familiar with the station and knows when something is suspicious. So we do have layered protection with biological detection. Some places use chemical detection, long guns are deployed, you have counter surveillance, and by that I mean members that are not in uniform, that have been trained to look for suspicious activity. And then I think the strong intelligence sharing that we have that may involve federal partners and may not. The group that's in partnership in New York have each other on a speed dial and texts. The chief texted me when we had the derailment in Philadelphia to see if I needed any resources or support. And of course, in an event like the one we had in Philadelphia, the first inquiry is always, is there an act of terrorism? I can speak to what happened Friday at Union Station, which was not an active shooter situation, but did involve a shooting. And we had done quite a bit of training with our employees, our business owners, our property manager, and our passengers. And people did what we had taught them to do. Our businesses locked the doors, turned off the lights, and hid. Our employees hunkered down, in some cases in the back in the track area where they took passengers. We had a cellar that was loading. Our crews got on there, locked everybody down on that train, and we had a response from the region because we were surging that day, but we had a coordinated response, and within 14 minutes we had train service back up because of the way that event was mitigated, the way things were communicated, and the strong partnerships that we have. I think think you alluded to the fact that something did happen in 1993 in the Long Island Railroad. 6 people were killed and almost 20 people were injured by somebody in that case was mentally ill, but still came on the train with a gun. An off-duty Long Island Railroad police officer was the one that made the lockup. But in that case, much like France, the passengers on that train jumped on that guy and subdued him. So I think it's a combination of factors with law enforcement, our partnerships, the training we provide our employees, and the intelligence that we share as a community. Did I answer your question, sir?
Yes, I mean, we could be here all day really discussing it, and it's unfair to ask you to summarize it so quickly, but that's the time we have. I know I'm just in my time limit, but Mr. Diaz, if you could briefly respond to my question.
Chairman, I think as of September of 2014, at the governor's direction, if you look at Penn Station and some of our major terminals like Grand Central, we substantially increased, probably about 40% on the MTAPD side, increased our police presence there, our uniform presence. In addition to that, the National Guard, New York National Guard, was substantially increased in our terminals. The New York State Police now have also present in both of our terminals, Penn Station and Grand Central Station, in addition to riding our trains. So I feel very comfortable with the level of uniform presence we have in those terminals. However, there is a concern because we were able to support that through transit security grant funding, and a large part of that funding had expired August 31st. We sort of we're running out of money. We thought we would probably have to cut back a little, but the direction for our governor's office was that he did not want to see an increase. So we've been spending a lot of money to put those extra resources there, and that is a concern of mine at some point that we're not going to have the funds.
A vast operation and do it as successfully as you have. Now, taking into consideration the fact that obviously money is a big priority, and we hear you loud and clear about funds drying up being a big making it more challenging for you to do your job, but you do it pretty well. I mean, I ride the subway, and I'm pretty amazed that it's done. I mean, you have issues, but how do you get it right? And the report that Ms. Grover did, what, if any, improvements would you make if you could?
Well, what I'd like to say, the New York City Police Department actually patrols our transit system. We have about 2,600 officers, and they do a fantastic job. I mean, crime is like a minimum number of crime. We average about, I think, 6 crimes a day for that entire transportation system. They do a fantastic job at patrolling it. We have surge operations. We have bag inspections, robust canine units that patrol those areas. We have a pretty elaborate CCTV and electronic security systems, intrusion detection. Our tunnels are hardened to make it difficult for anybody to get into our tunnels and do anything to our trains and to our infrastructure. We have a lot of infrastructure protection, in addition to the railroad. So we have, it was mentioned earlier, Penn Station. If you look at Penn Station, you have bollards that circle almost the entire station. So if someone with a bomb and a large vehicle, they are not going to get into that station. So we feel very comfortable with that. But those are the types of things that we like to do to protect our system. And again, it takes money to do that.
So you describe a very good relationship, obviously, with the NYPD. My question would be to Ms. Hanson, to you again, Mr. Diaz and Mr. Manshine. You know, the chairman said in his opening statement that up to this point, a lot of the focus, or at least before the incident that happened in Paris, or outside of Paris, a lot of the focus in terms of security and transportation security has been on the aviation industry. So what I'd like you to talk about, the three of you, is what level of cooperation and coordination do you have with people who are focused on that area, aviation security, and land and surface security, because there's a lot of overlap there. So however you want to take the answer.
Well, I could just say on the intelligence side and information sharing, like recently there was some threats to aviation. We get immediate notifications for our partners at TSA. We have excellent communication when it comes to intelligence. I'm very impressed. I mean, every day I get intelligence information from all of our law enforcement partners, our governmental partners. I have a interagency counterterrorism task force that every day gets briefings from all of those other areas and puts together a nice briefing package. We get that before 7 o'clock every morning. We distribute that to other law enforcement agencies. The information sharing, I think, is really outstanding. We have offices embedded into JTTF, New York City Intel, counterterrorism. The information sharing, I think, is outstanding. I don't think there's any problem with that. There was a TSOC, I know, was mentioned about an hour ago. I just saw a TSOC notification from our New York City Transit to TSOC regarding a fare evader that didn't pay a fare and had a firearm on him illegally. So I think we've come a long way.
So, Mr. Manchin, because I have one question that I want to ask all of you. Would you agree, and Ms. Hanson, would you agree with Mr. Diaz's assessment?
Oh, absolutely. I think what has happened with the surface transportation system is almost magical. It's a perfect match of government and the private sector coordinating instantaneously and sharing information back and forth. This is all pretty much in absence of regulations. Aviation, maritime is heavily regulated, not so much in the surface. This has all been done because of the need to do it, and this constant sharing back and forth is really quite tremendous. And we make each other better. They improve what we do, we improve what they do. We share the best practices across the networks, and when we get information from GAO about improvements that need to be made, we welcome those and make those improvements. We just can continually get better, and it's pretty amazing for me.
Ms. Hanson, would you add anything to that?
Yes, two things. The federal security directors out of the airports, we do have a close relationship with them at Amtrak because we do get resources from them, and so there's regular dialogue. The other thing that I would say, which was a point that you had made, so aviation, and this isn't just recently, since September 11th, the focus has really been on aviation. And of course, aviation moves millions of people a year, and mass transit moves billions. But the funding has been the reverse. So the money is focused on aviation versus transportation. And I would ditto my colleague here, where because of the appropriations, the 2015 money has been delayed. We do rely on that money for additional resources for events that we will have, such as the Pope, in our case, the Super Bowls, and events like that where we have an increased threat because of the increased ridership. So the funding that we've gotten from the intercity passenger grant and that they've gotten from the transit security grant is something we've really come to rely on, and is what has allowed MTA to do the infrastructure that they've done and the campaigns and some of the intelligence sharing. So that would be dramatic for us to have a reduction in funding.
Message received. Well done. One last question. In 5 words or less, what is the biggest threat to our surface transportation system?
Certainly the unknown, the homegrown, unknown, violent extremists. They're like a unguided missile, like a Scud missile. We just don't know that they're there. I think that's the biggest threat.
The fact that the systems are just wide open.
It's been explosives, it will be explosives, and then the lone wolf is a serious consideration, because somebody with a weapon, we see what they can do, and somebody with a knife, we see what they can do. But it's the combination of lone wolf and explosives.
I concur.
Great, thank you. Well, Mr. Chairman, I just ask unanimous consent that Mr. Langevin be allowed to sit and question the witnesses during this hearing.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism Intelligence, the esteemed gentleman from New York, Mr. King, for any questions he may have. He told me to say esteemed, by the way.
We're supposed to be very esteemed, but in any event. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, let me just say that, as Ms. Rice said, the message is received, and I really have to make sure that we deliver that to people in my party who play games with the spending and don't realize there's consequences. And any talk of government shutdown or money not coming, even if it comes months from now, the damage can be done. So your message is well received, certainly by me. I have 2 questions, and it will be to Mr. Diaz and to Chief Hanson. First of all, thank you both for your testimony, and all of you for your testimony. And to you two in law enforcement for the work you've done over the years. Two questions. Taking Penn Station to Grand Central, where everything comes together. You have New York City subway system, you have Metro North, you have Amtrak. How well constituted are you as far as incident command? Who is in charge when something occurs? Is that delineated as to who's responsible when an incident occurs? And also, does the FDNY get involved in that? Because here you have, let's see, at least 4 police departments, you have the National Guard, and again, I'm just wondering, has that all coordinated as to who's in charge and who's not? And secondly on that, I know going back to years ago with the transit police, there was the problem with communications. How are the communications, the radio communications between the various police departments at Penn Station and Grand Central? That's probably the one area where all of you come together. And either one, Mr. Diaz, you can go first.
Yes, Chairman. Incident command, again, the Grand Central is a Metro North property. We do have also a New York City Transit presence in Grand Central. We have a great relationship, them, great working relationship. There's a fire brigade assigned to Grand Central that works for Metro North, and they have a great relationship with the fire department, all of the fire department chiefs. And I think as far as interoperability, I think we get along very good. As far as radio communication, that might be a little more difficult, but I think more important than radio communication, I think, is interagency cooperation and interagency interaction with each other. And I think that we get the job done.
I would say at Penn Station, very similar. We have a very strong emergency manager there. People know where to come. There are regular exercises.
Emergency manager, is he with Amtrak?
He is, yes, sir. Retired NYPD and has a very close relationship with the fire department. Everybody knows where to come. They regularly exercise, and unfortunately, there are enough events, smoke in a tunnel, that people do have an opportunity to exercise those capabilities. I think interoperability will always be an issue, even with our potential access to 800 megahertz. It's not so much just being, on the frequency. It's the other back end, cabling in a tunnel and some of the infrastructure that's so old. But I think we have very strong relationships, very strong incident and unified command. And I would want to go back to one of your points about funding, and I'm not belaboring it, but sequestration did impact us very negatively in our case. It diminished our grants by $500,000, and it set us back over a year for our K-9 program with TSA. And so we have one person in TSA K-9 training now, and if the government shuts down, I would imagine that they have to come back home. We have 2 more dog handlers going to Lackland Air Force Base in October, and I would imagine if there's a shutdown, they have to come down. So it's taken us a year to catch up because of sequestration, and now when we're trying to build our K-9 program back up, we'll be limited by what happens here.
One final question, and is everyone allowed to partake in tabletop exercises as far as the police departments?
And I think what you heard earlier in the testimony from TSA was at Amtrak's request, TSA sponsored a I-STEP tabletop in Philadelphia. It was for all first responders and federal, local, state entity, and it was the first tabletop, and it was very effective, very well received.
Okay. Thank you all for your testimony and your service. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. King. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, just let me thank you, because a lot of what you do is about what didn't happen, and you rarely get credit for what didn't happen. So thanks for all you've done to keep things from happening. Lawrence Wright wrote a book called The Looming Tower, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about 9/11. And in it, he recounts the experience of an FBI agent working in his office in New York City. And when the second plane hit the South Tower, he physically got sick because he knew that between the FBI, the CIA, and other law enforcement agencies, that they had the intelligence to perhaps thwart that attack on New York City and the nation. So the sharing of information was very, very important, from which the Patriot Act came. A lot of things were added on to it that were objectionable to people, but the bottom line, the original thrust, was to remove the barriers that existed between various law enforcement agencies so that they could pool their resources, they could share information toward the goal of more effectively stopping terrorist activity. Mr. Diaz, New York City is probably, all of its law enforcement agencies, all the affiliates, is probably the greatest counterterrorism organization in the world. Not out of choice, but out of necessity. And you touched on it a little bit, but you would also mention that there's 6 million people that travel on those trains every day in 78 different trains. Can you talk a little bit more about how that information is shared? Is that a result of policy, or is it a result of just the intuitive relationship that exists between law enforcement agencies towards the same goal, and that's protecting your common constituency?
Yes, sir. I think we all have the same goal. Again, like I said earlier, we have detectives that are assigned to JTTF, that are assigned to HIDA, that are assigned to NYPD counterterrorism and NYPD intelligence. There is great information sharing. I mean, we talk together all of the time. Every day I receive briefings and alerts. And I can say that it's funny because it's not just at working hours. We have such a great relationship. We have fraternal organizations, and we see each other at evening, at dinners, and other places. So we're constantly talking to each other. I think we've come a long, long ways from 9/11, and I don't think those issues that existed then exist anymore today.
So I presume that that's driven in large part by just an inherent sense that New York City is always going to be a major target. It's a high-impact target, and thus the role of law enforcement agencies working together is probably, while it's important generally, it seems to be particularly important in a city like New York.
Well, I would say a couple of things to that. Amtrak has assigned somebody to the National Terrorism Task Force so that we have the overarching, because we're in 46 states. One of the things that I would highlight, though, is after September 11th, then Amtrak Police Chief Sonia Proctor established a group called the Northeast Corridor Coalition. And so that group starts in D.C. and goes to New York City. And regularly, there's an intelligence component to that, and then there's the higher level executives, to include myself, Chief Bratton, and the chiefs in every town, state, from D.C. to New York. Tremendous amount of exposure for some people who the first time we rode the train didn't even know the Amtrak went through their city. And so that has allowed a growth of information sharing, relationships, a real sensitivity that people don't always have towards transportation policing. Transportation policing is very different and defined and specific, and that's why that community of folks that are very similarly situated with those responsibilities is so important for those groups to share information.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. The chair now recognizes a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman Katko and Chairman King, both, for holding this hearing. The terrorist attacks of September 11th certainly showed the entire nation that terrorists are willing to go to virtually any length and any means to inflict harm on the American people. In the years after September 11th, the federal government has certainly taken a number of necessary steps to secure our airports and our airplanes from future attacks. But as we all know, terrorists don't operate under conventional rules. I know this well as a former terrorism prosecutor. Terrorists adapt and they find new methods to exploit security and vulnerabilities to achieve their goal of mass casualties. And so we've seen that in, frankly, places around the world. The district that I represent, the 4th Congressional District of Texas, is full of small towns, like many of those that span this entire country. Almost all those communities have a bus stop and a train stop, whereas they may not have an airport. So I'd like to start with you, Ms. Hansen. Do you happen to know how many commercially operated passenger air traffic hubs there are in the United States?
I flunk.
Well, the reason I ask is that I understand, and it might be a better question for Mr. Meyershine. I think it's around 200. The reason I ask is, by comparison, how many Amtrak stations are there around the country?
Well, we go to 500 destinations, and what I'd like to tell you is that in small towns that you talked about, we took DHS money to train our partners in those small towns who we are very reliant on. We have regional detectives, but some of the response time, depending on where they are in relation to the train, could be an hour, 2 hours. So we have had those detectives cultivate close relationships with local law enforcement. The RailSafe program that we described is an output of that. So we call on those folks during particular times to work with us and other partners to increase visibility. What I did was take DHS money to create a day-and-a-half course that, first of all, identifies what the threat is in the transportation environment. It explains how Amtrak collects intelligence and shares it, and then we run through a tabletop exercise, one for a suspicious package and one for an active shooter. We have done that in starting in 2015 and trained hundreds of law enforcement folks in 11 states.
Okay, so, but in terms of response time and some of what you related, that's important. But before we get there, I guess, my concern is what we've seen in Europe, and I've intimated before that we've seen a number of surface transportation terrorist attacks. And last week I was at Union Station, took an Amtrak train, and I didn't go through security at all when I got on that train like I do at an airport. Other than the things that you just related.
Well, you may not have thought you went through security. We have a very robust vapor wake detection program. So those dogs that you see walking around there that look so nice with the floppy ears and they're very animated and excited, were possibly smelling your wake to see if you had explosives. We also, as I mentioned earlier, have tactical units that are doing counter surveillance. So they're observing people's behavior. We also have people on trains and other capabilities. So you may not have seen the security. It doesn't mean that it's not there. Unfortunately, last year we had an attack on a train, Niles, Michigan. There we do not have the resources. They attacked our conductor. Hurt him very bad. It was an emotionally disturbed man. We had to rely on the Niles Police Department, who came and mitigated that situation. So it was a coordination of our efforts with our local law enforcement colleagues to respond.
Okay. Well, and as I related, I didn't go through a formal security checkpoint or clearance like you see at the airport. One of the other things was that neither did my luggage that was with me, and I didn't see that. And on trains, you see different sizes of everything from large suitcases to backpacks. Other than dogs and walking patrols, are there any mechanisms in place for the inspection of luggage?
Amtrak is going to start a program starting October 1st where there's going to be restrictions imposed on the size and number of luggage. As a result of that, there may be more observation about luggage, but no, we are not screening your luggage like an airline does.
Okay. Well, I see my 5 minutes went very quickly, so I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member. According to the rail industry officials, the transport of crude oil on trains through dense urban areas has increased 40-fold since 2008. In addition to that, over the past decade or so, railroads have begun shipping large quantities of flammable liquids such as ethanol and crude oil, creating an entirely new response challenge. Every day, dangerous rail freight carrying security-sensitive cargo travels throughout my district, weaving through residential areas and passing by schools and homes and businesses. In fact, Bakken crude, the more flammable oil, which makes it probably the most dangerous to transport, travels along New Jersey's rail lines at a volume of 15 to 30 million gallons per day. I've said it before in the whole committee and in my subcommittees, and I'll say it again. My district has the two most dangerous miles in America for terrorist targets, and that is in the area around Newark, New Jersey, and Elizabeth, where the rail, the interstate, the airport, the port, and chemical installations are within a 2-mile radius. With that said, Mr. Manchin, did I get it right? No. Yes. All right. What role does TSA play in ensuring that dangerous rail freight and the communities that they must travel through are secure as can be? And I have put forth the legislation in order to strengthen the rail cars that carry these dangerous oil. So, to my question.
So there's a couple levels here. First of all, this rail sensitive security material, the RSSM, is something that we do pay attention to, that is regulated. It's inspected. There are regulations that require inspections for certain things. So that's your toxic inhalation hazards, your liquefied chlorine, all the methanethanol bad stuff that is on trains. But that's not Bakken crude. That is a hazardous material, a different classification. Mm-hmm. And there are regulations requiring hazardous material. So with the rate of inspections that go with this RSSM material, when it's transferred from shippers, there's required inspections. When it transfers from one company's rail car to another company's rail car, there are required inspections, surveillance of paperwork, and that sort of thing.
Okay, and as we've seen over the past several years, the major explosion in Canada, we had an incident in Lynchburg, Virginia, where and also a situation where a train derailed and fell into the James River in Virginia. Very concerned about those issues. So how does TSA track the trains carrying the hazardous material in real time, and are there any steps taken en route for trains from high-threat urban areas? And mind you, my other issue is when these cars are sitting rail side, the security that is in place seems very lacking when it's just sitting in the yard to move to its next destination.
So if there's RSSM, this toxic stuff, the car needs to be attended. I mean, that's part of the requirement. It needs to be attended.
Right. We're finding that that's not the case, though, to the degree that we feel that it's necessary in order to secure that.
Okay, I'll take that back and take a look at that for you and get back to you specifically and get you very specific data, particularly for the Newark area. Mm-hmm. To the other point of your question is the TSA doesn't currently track hazardous materials in real time. So we don't presently do that. The TSA does have regulation and procedures in place to locate shipments of rail security and sensitive materials in the event of a elevated threat condition. So if there's an elevated threat condition, we'll immediately reach out to the partners, the railroads, and they have 30 minutes to respond back to us to identify where those toxic inhalation hazards, those RSSM materials are located.
Okay. And Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our panel of witnesses here today. If I could, I'd like to change tack a bit and ask about another threat that's facing our surface transportation system, and that's relating to a cyber attack. So, Mr. Manchin, can you just give us a brief overview of TSA's actions in this domain?
Well, we're just now developing. We've always had an eye on cybersecurity, but in the last year, this has become something that we're paying great attention to. Particularly, we've seen denial of service attacks at airlines, possibly other attacks. So we're we're connected through the interagency. We're talking to our partners out in the private sector about cybersecurity. We addressed it just recently. We had a newsletter that went out to our surface partners, and right on the front page was cybersecurity. So we're on top of it. We're learning like everyone else. This another new threat against our homeland.
Sure. I think it's important, especially when you look at things like SCADA attacks, that the same type of system that governs pumps and valves is the same thing that governs the switches and such to keep trains on track or to change track and such, and could obviously be potentially penetrated. But can you also describe TSA's role in developing guidance for the transportation sector as it relates to the NIST cyber framework?
Well, again, we are connected through all the agencies, and in my shop at the TSA, I am the NIST builder, so for the TSA, so I'm the direct connection there. So it's a vibrant, ongoing process, and I'd be welcome to come and talk to you about how we do that very specifically. It's very convoluted, complex, but there's some great work that's done there.
Sure. Well, I'd like to do some follow-up on that then.
That'd be great.
Mr. Diaz, Ms. Hanson, can you describe how you view the cybersecurity risk to your respective organizations? How do you go about making risk management decisions? And do you feel that you have adequate in-house resources for information security? And whom do you partner with to help protect your assets?
On the MTA PD side, we have a lieutenant and 2 investigators that are assigned to the FBI Cyber Task Force. I think we've gotten a little ahead of the curve on that because we haven't had any real issues. But our IT department is ahead of the curve on that, and they have a number of things in place. I'm not really a computer expert, but I know that we get probes every single day, numerous probes into our system, and they've all been defeated. But it is a concern, and we do have our personnel assigned with the FBI. So when that event comes, we have things in place that are ready to address it.
Ms. Hanson?
Amtrak used DHS funding to have a vulnerability risk assessment done. Our IT section, which is not in the police department, has increased their personnel and staffing. We closely align and have a very close relationship with the FBI. The FBI did recently put out some areas that they thought needed attention because of some of the threats from ISIL for September 11th. And because of that, they've got outsourced young hackers who work with our IT team, security team, to make sure that we're aware of who's trying to probe our system. We obviously have other concerns as a result of some of the new train sets we're building to make sure that we have and continue to work with the FBI about concerns there that could be in place to gather information that would be inadvertent and unintentional but have a bad consequence.
Thank you. Mr. Manchin, going back to you again, how does TSA handle reports of cybersecurity intrusions and events? Do they count as security incidents? Are they reported to the TSOC and entered into the web EOC system? And does TSA have any additional steps it takes for cyber incidents as compared to more traditional security events?
Well, again, we're just now building through a couple different departments at the TSA, a coalition inside the TSA to start paying attention to these. Not that we haven't been paying attention to them. I don't know specifically if this is a reported event. I will get back to you specifically if cyber events or cyber attacks are reportable to the TSOC. Certainly they should be, and I will require that. That's something that I can do. If they're not,
And I'd also like to know what happens once the cyber incident is reported. What's the follow-up? How do you ensure that the vulnerability is closed?
Well, again, if it's internal to the TSA, and I don't know of any of those events, but if it's something to one of our security partners that happen in the private sector, there's, again, this great dialogue and communication to kind of close those things. But in additional steps, we'll make sure that everybody within our stakeholders would know this sharing of information, that there was an attack, cyber attack, and how it was done, and we would share that immediately.
Ms. Grover, do you have anything to add?
Well, just that one of the 10 categories of incidents that's required to be reported to the TSOC is the general category of threats. So it would depend on the specific guidance that TSA had developed about how to define threats, about whether or not those are reported.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Yield
Mr.
back.
Langevin. Before we conclude, I just a couple of overarching observations I want to make. And number one is that when I was at the 9/11 Museum last Monday, September 8th, for our field hearing, there was much discussion about the fact that people forget about 9/11 outside of New York City because they think that the terrorist threat is just focused on New York City. And I know much of our testimony today was about New York City, but it's pretty clear to me, and it's pretty clear to the committee, that a terrorist threat is nationwide. And we can't stress enough the importance of having a discussion about a nationwide threats. And we've had a lot of discussion about New York and a little bit about Washington, but it is a nationwide threat, and I know you're all aware of that. But I just want the public to understand that it is not limited to New York City by any stretch of the imagination. And the recent lone wolf attacks that we've seen in Chattanooga and elsewhere bear that out. So it is a concern going forward that the diligence and the competence and the professionalism that's displayed in the major urban areas needs to be branched out to the other areas, and it's a discussion we need to continue to have. And I know with the resources the way they are, that is a major concern, so I'm sure we'll have more discussions about that going forward. The other thing is, Ms. Grover, you didn't have a lot of opportunity to speak today, and some people are relieved with that, some people are not when you're a witness, but I will tell you that your reports are always extremely well done, and we do read them, and we do digest them, and we do learn from them. So please keep up the good work that you're doing. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
All right. And now, I thank the witnesses, all of you, for your testimony, and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.